I'm Dan McGrath, and this is Election Integrity Watch. This week, we're featuring a free chapter of my book, The Voter Fraud Manual. This episode features Chapter 2, Defining Voter Fraud. You can get this complete book at danmcgrath.net or amazon.com. I'm not good at asking for money, but if you like the content, you are more than welcome to leave a tip at danmcgrath.net, or, better yet, buy a copy of the book. Defining Voter Fraud. For purposes of this book, voter fraud or election fraud mean any illegal activity meant to influence the conduct or outcome of an election. Generally, when talking about voter fraud, one may think of the actions of an individual voter. One person casting two ballots, perhaps by using someone else's identity, is voter fraud. Election fraud tends to imply a larger scale. Wholesale manipulation of vote tallies by electronic means, as one example. I usually follow that rough convention, but consider the definition the same for either term. There exists a sizable, well-funded industry whose primary purpose seems to be convincing the public and public officials that voter fraud is a myth, or so rare as to be safely considered insignificant. Let's call them fraud deniers. Groups such as the Brennan Center for Justice, for example, seem to prefer a narrower definition of voter fraud, in turn minimizing the numbers used to discuss voter fraud. While I would say voting by ineligible felons is just as much fraudulent voting as a person voting with his neighbor's name, the fraud deniers might say only the latter qualifies. Voting with a false identity is nearly impossible to prosecute after the fact because there logically can be no list of people who don't exist. And if two votes by the same person are detected, short of an admission, there is no way to know for certain who cast the second fraudulent ballot. This is why properly identifying voters before they cast a ballot is important. Once in the box, ballots are anonymous. There's no way to fish back out a fraudulent ballot once it's cast. Voting by ineligible people is easier to detect and prosecute, so concrete, irrefutable numbers of fraudulent votes can be determined with this kind of fraud. See the next chapter, Ineligible Voters, for more on this, which is why the fraud deniers would rather not count that as voter fraud. A common talking point among fraud deniers who oppose requiring photo identification to vote is that ID only stops voting with another voter's identity, which is exceedingly rare, so showing ID is an unnecessary burden. This argument is a specious straw man, however. Photo identification would help prosecute ineligible voters by establishing proof that they cast the ballot themselves. State-issued photo ID may also contain immigration information that could indicate a voter's ineligibility based on citizenship. Combined with an electronic poll book, also known as electronic rosters, capable of instant eligibility verification, like the 2010 Minnesota voter ID bill required, ineligible felons and wards would also be prevented from voting illegally. Importantly, voting with a false identity doesn't require stealing or borrowing a real person's identity to vote. Where ID isn't required, a voter can just make up a completely fictitious name to vote under and do it as many times as they wish. Early voting allows much more time to fabricate multiple ballots. False identity voting is one of the biggest areas of concern when it comes to examining voter fraud. More on that in the false identity voting chapter. So I don't subscribe to the narrow view that voting with a borrowed identity is the only illegal act that should be called voter fraud. I don't think anyone with a discerning brain would either, but it's important to understand that when fraud deniers talk about a lack of prosecutions for voter fraud, this bit of linguistic gymnastics is how they sometimes justify such false statements. Voter fraud or election fraud is any illegal act meant to influence the operation or outcome of an election. The definition is simple, and there is a mountain of evidence showing that it is far too common and consequential. The deniers shamelessly pretend it doesn't exist, even standing in the shadow of that mountain and looking straight at it. They ridicule and impugn any who point at it, but that irrational and desperate posture only proves that they know what a problem it is as they desperately and hopelessly try to keep it from being noticed. The beauty of truth is that it is what it is, forever. Truth is indelible and it is patient. It may be covered up for a time, but it requires eternal vigilance to keep buried, for its inexorable nature is to rise towards the light. Some non-exhaustive examples of voter fraud crimes include forging signatures on petitions, voting out of jurisdiction, voting more than once, voting while ineligible, voting for deceased or inactive voters still on the active roster, voting on behalf of someone not mentally capable of voting, stuffing the ballot box. There are several ways to do this. Altering official counts, electronically or on paper, destroying ballots or records during required retention periods, registering ineligible persons to vote, non-citizens, etc., registering fictitious identities to vote, inflating voter rolls, such as false registrations or by not removing known deceased, moved, and ineligible voters as required by law, paying someone to vote, coercing someone to vote, using physical violence, threats, or intimidation to discourage voting, misdirecting voters, providing false polling date, time, location, certifying false statements or documents, access disparities, providing unequal polling place locations or core resources per capita. Excessive lines and unreasonable inconvenience may discourage and suppress voters in targeted areas. Improperly accepting or rejecting absentee or mail-in ballots. Ballot harvesting schemes. There are a few super easy ways to cheat. Swearing false oaths, such as vouching fraud, among other things. Thanks for listening. You can get the Voter Fraud Manual at Amazon.com or danmcgrath.net. Stay tuned for Chapter 3.